My name is Fatima Mahmud, and I am a female Imam. What I am going to share with you is something that shook me to the core. It was a moment of life and death that completely changed my understanding of fasting, prayer, and the spiritual realm. I died for 9 minutes and 20 seconds. The event that led to my death was sudden and unexpected, but during that time, I found myself standing in a place of unimaginable peace and light. There, I met Jesus, which shook me to the core, so subscribe to the channel, so let's start. As soon as I arrived in that extraordinary place, everything around me was filled with light that seemed to come from every direction, filling every corner and space. It wasn't the kind of light that hurt your eyes or felt harsh. It was soft, gentle, and pure. It was as if the light itself was alive, warm and embracing, wrapping me in a sense of safety and peace. There was no fear, no anxiety, just calmness. For a moment, I couldn't even comprehend where I was or what was happening. But then I saw him. The figure before me was a man, yet unlike anyone I had ever seen in my life. He stood before me, radiating light and love. His presence was overwhelming, not in a scary or intimidating way, but in a way that made me feel completely safe, completely seen. He was surrounded by an aura of serenity that made everything else seem unimportant, as if time itself had stopped to acknowledge his presence. His face shone with compassion, and his eyes were unlike any eyes I had ever looked into. They were filled with such deep understanding, such kindness, that I felt like he could see into the very depths of my soul. In those eyes, there was no judgment, only a love so profound that it made everything else fade away. And then he spoke. His voice was soft yet powerful, like the most comforting lullaby, but at the same time, it carried an authority that could not be ignored. When he said my name, Fatima, it sounded like music, like a gentle call that echoed through my very being. The moment he spoke, I knew, without any doubt, that I was standing in the presence of someone far greater than I could have ever imagined. This was not just a man. This was a being of light, someone who had transcended the limits of human understanding. "You have come to learn the truth," he said, his words resonating in my heart with a kind of clarity that I had never known before. It wasn't just a statement, it was a calling, a reminder that I was here for a purpose. That very moment, I felt as if the weight of my entire life had been lifted off my shoulders, and for the first time, I understood that truth was not something to be understood with the mind alone. It was something to be felt, something to be embraced with the heart. I stood there in awe, but also in a sense of peace that I couldn't fully explain. The confusion I had carried with me throughout my life seemed to dissolve in that presence. I realized then that I wasn't just meeting Jesus. Jesus had come to meet me in my moment of vulnerability, to show me a truth that was deeper than any belief I had held before. I stood there, still overwhelmed by the light and the presence of Jesus, but a part of me couldn't shake the confusion. I had no idea why I was here, why this moment had come to me. I felt a deep sense of awe, but also a lingering uncertainty, a sense that something was missing, something important that I didn't fully understand. It was in that stillness, when I could hardly think, that he asked me a question that would shake everything I thought I knew. "Do you know the true purpose of fasting, Fatima?" His voice was gentle, but carried a weight that made me pause. I felt a lump form in my throat, as if the question itself held the key to a mystery I hadn't yet uncovered. I nodded, unsure if I truly knew the answer, but thinking I did. In my mind, fasting was about discipline, self-control, and fulfilling a religious obligation. It was something I had done for years, something ingrained in me. I had always thought that fasting was about controlling my body, denying it what it wanted, to show my devotion and obedience to Allah. But then Jesus spoke again, and his words cut through my thoughts with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "It is not just about hunger," he said, his tone soft yet firm, "but about surrendering your will to God." The moment he said this, a flood of understanding washed over me. I had never considered fasting in this way before. All these years, I had focused on the physical aspect, how my body felt when it was deprived of food and water. But now, as Jesus spoke, I realized that the deeper purpose of fasting wasn't about enduring discomfort or simply following rules. It was about aligning my soul with the will of God, about surrendering my desires and my control to Him. It wasn't just a practice of abstaining from food. It was a way to humble myself, to remind myself that I was not in control. I had thought that fasting was about denying myself, but Jesus revealed that it was truly about opening myself up to God. It was about letting go of my ego and trusting that His will, not mine, was what mattered most. In that moment, fasting became less of a burden and more of a beautiful act of submission, an act of faith. I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that this was the true purpose: to surrender, to trust, and to deepen my relationship with God in a way I had never imagined before. As I stood there, still reeling from the profoundness of His words, I felt something shift inside me, something deep within my heart that I had never fully understood. Jesus, with His gentle, compassionate presence, moved closer to me. His eyes, filled with such warmth and understanding, never left mine. And then, without a word, He placed His hand over my heart. It wasn't just a physical touch. It felt as though His touch was reaching right into the core of my being, touching a place I didn't even know existed. The moment His hand rested over my chest, I felt a warmth, a sense of deep connection that transcended anything I had ever known. It was like He was speaking directly to the essence of who I was, beyond the layers of my thoughts and beliefs. He didn't need to say anything more, but He did. His voice, still as calming as before, filled the air around us. "When you fast, it is your soul that should hunger for God, not just your body," He said, His words sinking deep into my heart. I had always thought of fasting as a way to deny the body, to refrain from eating or drinking, to show my devotion and self-discipline. But now, as I stood there with Jesus, those thoughts began to unravel. It wasn't about punishing the body or enduring hunger for hunger's sake. It was about something far greater. Jesus was revealing to me that fasting was a journey of the soul, a way for the heart to seek God with a hunger that went beyond physical needs. It was not merely about abstaining from food. It was about longing for something deeper, the divine connection, the closeness to God. Jesus continued, "It is a purification of the heart, not only the stomach." Those words resonated deeply with me. My heart, so often clouded with distractions, desires, and worldly concerns, was the very place that needed purification. The fast wasn't meant to only cleanse the body. It was an invitation to cleanse the heart, to free it from anything that separated me from God's love. It wasn't about counting the hours of hunger, but about embracing the stillness, the quiet space where the soul could reconnect with its Creator. For the first time, I understood that fasting wasn't just a ritual. It was an opportunity for spiritual renewal. It was a chance to let go of all the noise, all the things that filled my life and my mind, and focus solely on the One who sustains me. It was about surrendering not just my food, but my heart, my soul, and my will to God. That moment with Jesus changed my entire perspective on fasting. It became not a hardship, but a beautiful opportunity to grow closer to God, to nourish my soul rather than simply my body. As I stood before Jesus, I was still processing everything He had shared with me, but something about his presence made it feel as though time itself had slowed down, allowing me to fully absorb his words. He looked at me with such tenderness, and as he spoke, I felt his message penetrate the very core of my being, far beyond the surface of my thoughts. He began to speak about prayer, and it felt like a veil was being lifted from my eyes. I had always understood prayer as a set of words, a ritual to follow at certain times of the day. It was something I had learned to do from a young age, an act of devotion and discipline. I would speak the words of the prayer, recite verses, and ask for forgiveness or guidance. But as Jesus spoke, I realized that there was so much more to prayer than the mere act of speaking words or fulfilling an obligation. His voice, filled with both warmth and authority, softened as he said, "Your prayers should not only be words, but a true connection with God." It was as though a light bulb had gone off in my heart. My prayers had always been filled with words, yes, but they had often felt like a routine, a list of things to say, rather than an authentic exchange. I had recited the same prayers every day, but I hadn't truly understood that prayer wasn't about the form, but about the connection. Jesus was showing me that prayer is about the heart reaching out to the divine, not simply about fulfilling a set of prescribed phrases. When you pray, he continued, your spirit is speaking directly to the divine. The simplicity of that statement stunned me. I had never fully grasped that my prayers were meant to be more than just words flowing from my lips. Prayer was the language of the soul, a moment when my spirit could speak directly to God, bypassing the limitations of words and thoughts. It was a moment of communion where I could lay bare my heart, my fears, my desires, and my gratitude to the one who truly understood me. Jesus explained that prayer was not something to be done mechanically, but with full awareness. It was meant to be an exchange of love, an invitation to be vulnerable before God. In that space, it wasn't about asking for things or listing out my needs, but about truly opening my heart and listening. I realized then that prayer wasn't just a one-way conversation where I asked for guidance. It was a two-way dialogue where my soul reached out in sincerity and God responded in His infinite love. His words changed how I would approach my prayers forever. I understood that each prayer was an opportunity to deepen my relationship with God, to speak from the heart, and to listen for His guidance in the quiet spaces of my soul. Prayer was not just a routine to follow. It was a sacred conversation, a profound connection that reached beyond words. It was an intimate moment between me and the divine, one that required honesty, vulnerability, and an open heart. As I stood in the presence of Jesus, I felt as though every word He spoke was a mirror, reflecting parts of myself that I had never truly examined. He continued to speak with such clarity and love, and each message seemed to pierce my heart with profound insight. When He spoke about righteousness, His words struck me deeply, leaving me with a truth I hadn't fully understood before. Do not let your righteousness become a show for others, He said, His voice gentle yet firm. At first, those words seemed simple, but as He spoke further, I realized the depth behind them. I had always believed that doing good deeds, following the rules, and living a righteous life was about how others perceived me. It was easy to get caught up in the idea of being seen as a good person, helping others, praying in public, observing religious practices, and making sure people knew I was doing the right thing. I had been proud of my outward actions, convinced that they proved my faith and goodness. But Jesus was showing me a completely different perspective. True righteousness is not about what others see, but what God sees in your heart. His words pierced through the surface and went straight to the root of the matter. My intentions. It was never about how I appeared to others, how many good deeds I could list, or how perfectly I could follow religious customs. What truly mattered, he said, was the purity of my heart and the sincerity of my actions. True righteousness wasn't about impressing others with my external actions. It was about living in alignment with God's will, doing good for the right reasons and not for recognition. He pointed out how often we, as humans, focus on outward actions without considering the purity of our intentions. I had been guilty of that, of measuring my goodness based on how others perceived me. But Jesus was asking me to look deeper. He wanted me to understand that God was not concerned with the external performance, but with the inner state of my heart. Was I helping others because I truly cared for them, or was I doing it to earn praise? Was I praying because I longed to connect with God, or was I praying to be seen as pious? This realization shook me to my core. It wasn't just about doing the right things, it was about doing them with a heart that was sincere and pure. Jesus was urging me to examine my intentions, to strip away the pride and the need for approval, and to focus on cultivating a heart that was aligned with God's love and will. The illusion of righteousness, living for the approval of others, was a barrier between me and the true essence of spiritual purity. I now understood that righteousness was not a performance for the world to admire. It was a quiet, humble devotion to God, a reflection of the love and compassion He wanted to see within me. As Jesus spoke to me, His words seemed to echo in the stillness, resonating in a way that reached deep into my soul. His presence, warm and full of understanding, conveyed something more profound than I had ever expected. I had spent so much time focused on rituals, on following the rules, on fulfilling obligations. But as he shared his wisdom, I began to realize that there was an essential truth that I had overlooked, something that lay at the heart of everything. Your fasting and prayers mean nothing if they are not coupled with love for others, he said, his voice gentle yet powerful. I had always thought that my devotion to God, my prayers, and my fasting were the most important aspects of my faith. I believed that these acts were the core of my connection to God. But as Jesus spoke, I began to see a broader picture, one that included something far more essential than simply the outward acts of worship. It was as if he was pointing out a blind spot in my understanding. I had never truly considered that my relationship with God wasn't just defined by how often I prayed or how perfectly I followed the rules. While those practices were important, they were only part of the equation. Jesus made me realize that the foundation of all true devotion was love. Love not just for God, but for the people around me. Without compassion for others, without a heart that reached out to those in need, my fasting and prayers were incomplete. They were hollow, empty acts if they were not filled with the essence of love and service. Serve those in need, for that is the true path to God, he continued. His words carried a weight that I couldn't ignore. I had always thought that serving others was a nice thing to do, an act of kindness or charity. But now, Jesus was showing me that serving others wasn't just a good deed, it was a sacred calling, a vital expression of faith. It was through caring for others, especially the most vulnerable, that we truly walk in the path of God. The way we treat others, the way we show compassion, becomes the ultimate reflection of our devotion. In that moment, I realized that love was not just an abstract concept or an emotion to feel. It was an active force, something that had to be embodied in the way we lived our lives. Every time I reached out to help someone, every time I showed kindness, every time I served with a pure heart, I was moving closer to God. My relationship with Him wasn't just about personal worship. It was about how I showed up in the world, how I loved and cared for others. Without that, everything else was incomplete. Jesus opened my eyes to the truth that true faith was not measured by how well I could follow rituals, but by how deeply I could love and serve others. It was love in action that connected us to God and to each other. And it was through compassion that we truly became vessels of His grace. As Jesus spoke to me, there was a softness in His voice that conveyed not just understanding, but a deep love that transcended anything I had ever known. His words weren't just teachings, they felt like an invitation, a gentle pull towards something greater than I had ever imagined. He asked me a question that seemed so simple, yet it unraveled something deep within me. "Why do you fast, Fatima?" I paused, unsure how to respond. The answer that came to my mind felt almost automatic, a response shaped by years of tradition and practice. "To fulfill my duty as a Muslim," I answered, almost without thinking. It was what I had been taught, the reason I had fasted year after year. It was my duty, my responsibility, something I was expected to do. But as soon as the words left my mouth, I realized that they didn't carry the depth or the meaning I had always believed they did. Jesus smiled gently at my answer, His eyes filled with love and compassion. There was no judgment, only an understanding that reached beyond the surface. Religion is not just about duty, it is about a relationship with God, He said softly. His words seemed to sink into me slowly, like water soaking into dry soil, filling the empty spaces in my heart. For the first time, I began to see fasting and all religious practices not as obligations, but as opportunities to build a relationship with the divine. I had always thought of my faith as something I had to perform, a list of tasks I had to check off to be a good Muslim. I had been so focused on fulfilling my duty, on the outward observances, that I had lost sight of the true purpose behind them. Jesus was showing me that faith was not meant to be a list of actions. It was meant to be a living, breathing connection with God, a relationship founded on love, trust, and devotion. He continued, his voice tender and steady. "Don't let rituals become chains, for the heart must be free." Those words felt like a key unlocking something inside me. I realized how often I had allowed my practices to become shackles, binding me to external expectations rather than allowing them to flow from a place of love and surrender. I had allowed the structure of rituals, the musts and shoulds of religion, to define my faith, but in doing so, I had neglected the most important part, the freedom of the heart. Religion, he was showing me, wasn't about performing rituals because I had to. It was about performing them because they drew me closer to God. The true beauty of faith lay not in the outward actions, but in the transformation of the heart. It was in the moments of genuine connection, when I was fully present with God, that I truly worshiped. Fasting wasn't just about abstaining from food, it was about surrendering my heart to God, seeking His presence, and allowing my soul to grow closer to Him. Jesus' words helped me see that the essence of faith was not about checking off boxes or following tradition for tradition's sake. It was about love, freedom, and connection. Rituals should be a pathway to deeper communion with God, not chains that bind the heart. They should be expressions of the soul's longing to draw nearer to the divine, not tasks to be performed out of obligation. I understood then that true spiritual freedom comes when we let go of the burdens of duty and embrace the relationship we are meant to have with God. Our practices become joyful expressions of love, not obligations to be fulfilled. The heart, when free, becomes the truest place for worship, and through that freedom, we find the deepest connection with the divine. As I stood before Jesus, a sense of vulnerability swept over me, and for the first time, I felt an overwhelming urge to admit my deepest fears. The weight of those fears had been with me for so long, hidden beneath the surface, but now, in His presence, they bubbled up uncontrollably. My heart felt heavy with the fear of not being good enough, of falling short in my faith, and of failing in my commitment to God. I feared that my mistakes, my imperfections, would forever distance me from the divine. It was a fear that had quietly shaped so much of my life and had affected my every prayer, every action. I couldn't keep it in any longer. I finally spoke, my voice trembling. I fear that I'm not good enough, that I'll fail in my faith, that I won't live up to the expectations of God and those around me. As soon as the words left my lips, I realized how much I had been carrying, how heavy this burden had become. I had always felt as though I had to be perfect, to constantly strive for righteousness, but despite my efforts, I still feared I wasn't enough. I worried that all my striving, all my worship, might fall short, that I would somehow fail in my duty to God. Jesus looked at me with such understanding, his gaze full of compassion. There was no judgment, only love. He didn't need to say anything at first, and yet his presence alone was a balm to my wounded heart. After a moment of silence, he spoke softly, his voice filled with kindness and assurance. "Fear not, for God's love is greater than your mistakes," he said. His words were like a soothing wave, washing over my anxious heart and calming my restless soul. At that moment, I realized that I had been living under the weight of my own self-imposed expectations. I had been holding myself to an unattainable standard, one where perfection was the only acceptable outcome. But Jesus was telling me that my imperfections, my mistakes, were not what defined me. What truly mattered was God's love, a love that was far greater than any failure, far greater than any fear of not being enough. It wasn't about striving for perfection. It was about walking in faith, trusting in God's mercy, and knowing that his love was constant, no matter how many times I stumbled. Walk in faith and trust in his mercy, Jesus continued. His words lifted the heavy burden from my shoulders. I had always been so focused on my own shortcomings, on the fear of not living up to expectations, that I had forgotten to trust in the boundless mercy of God. His mercy was not a distant or abstract concept. It was a living, breathing reality, ready to embrace me with open arms. I didn't have to be perfect to receive his love. All I had to do was walk in faith, to trust that he would guide me and forgive me when I faltered. In that moment, I understood that faith wasn't about being flawless. It was about trusting in the journey, in the process of growth, and in the mercy of a loving God. I didn't have to carry the weight of fear anymore. God's love was greater than my mistakes, and his mercy would always be there to catch me when I fell. Walking in faith meant surrendering my fears, trusting that I was enough in his eyes, not because of my perfection, but because of his grace. As Jesus continued to speak, I felt as though he was guiding me toward a truth I had long resisted, one that seemed simple but was profoundly difficult to embrace. There was a deep stillness in his presence, a calm certainty that wrapped around me like a blanket. And as he spoke, I began to feel a shift inside me. "Surrender your will to God in every moment," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It is not about control, but about trusting that God's plan for you is perfect, even when it's hard to understand." At first, these words didn't fully make sense to me. I had always been someone who valued control. I believed that in order to live a good life, I needed to take charge, to plan, and to make sure everything fell into place. I had spent so much of my life striving, fighting, and managing every detail that I had never truly understood what it meant to surrender. To surrender felt like giving up, like losing all agency in my life, and that was something I had never been comfortable with. It felt foreign and unsettling, and I wondered if I could ever truly let go. But as he continued to speak, the words began to sink deeper into my heart. "It is not about control," he said again, as though reassuring me that surrendering didn't mean abandoning my own agency or responsibility. It wasn't about throwing up my hands in defeat or giving up on what I wanted for my life. It was about trusting that the bigger picture, the one that I couldn't always see, was being woven together in a way that was far more beautiful than I could ever imagine. God's plan for me, for all of us, was perfect, flawed in appearance but perfect in design. There was a peace in His words, a reassurance that I had been missing. I had been holding on so tightly to my own expectations, to my desire to control the outcome of my life. Every setback, every challenge felt like a failure. But what Jesus was teaching me in that moment was that life wasn't about forcing everything to go according to my plan. It was about learning to trust that even the struggles and hardships, the parts of life I didn't understand, were part of a greater plan. It was a plan that, even though it didn't always align with my own desires, was still good. He continued to speak with such love and patience, saying, even when it's hard to understand, trust that God's plan for you is perfect. Those words felt like a revelation. So often I had struggled with the hard moments in life, moments that didn't make sense and felt unfair. I had questioned why certain things had happened to me, why life seemed to take unexpected turns. But now I saw that every moment, every hardship was part of a larger story, one that I could not fully comprehend, but could trust was leading me to something greater. In surrendering, I was not losing my voice or my path. I was aligning myself with a divine purpose, one that was far wiser and more loving than anything I could have planned on my own. This wasn't a call to passivity, but to trust in the flow of life with faith. It was an invitation to release my grip on the outcomes, to stop forcing things to happen the way I thought they should, and to allow space for something greater to unfold. Surrendering was not giving up. It was giving in to the wisdom of a loving God who knew what was best for me. It was a choice to trust that everything, even the painful parts, were leading me to where I needed to be. In surrendering, I wasn't losing myself. I was gaining a deeper connection with the divine. When Jesus spoke to me, His words carried a weight of peace that I had never experienced before. It wasn't just His words, but the feeling behind them, the gentle reassurance, the calm certainty, and the love that seemed to fill every space around us. "You are free, Fatima," He said with a peaceful smile. The moment He spoke those words, I felt something shift deep within me, as if a heavy weight that I had carried for so long had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. For most of my life, I had lived with a deep sense of guilt and shame, often feeling unworthy of God's love and forgiveness. I had been taught that to be righteous meant never making mistakes, always striving for perfection. Yet, despite my efforts, I constantly felt like I was falling short. Every time I stumbled, every time I faltered in my faith, I felt as though I had failed God. I carried the burden of these feelings with me every day, believing that somehow my imperfections made me unworthy of the love I had always sought. But as Jesus spoke those words, something inside me began to change. "You are free," He said again, and this time I could almost feel the weight of my guilt and shame begin to melt away. In that instant, I realized something profound. Grace is not earned, it is freely given. The truth that Jesus was showing me was that God's love and mercy were not conditional on my perfection or my ability to live up to a set of standards. His grace was unconditional, and it was available to me, not because I was perfect, but because I was loved. When Jesus told me that I was free, I understood that freedom wasn't just a concept. It was a reality that I could embrace. To accept God's grace meant to release the chains of guilt that had bound me for so long. It meant that I no longer had to live under the shadow of my mistakes, constantly feeling unworthy. I was free to live in the light of God's love, free to make mistakes and learn from them, knowing that His grace would always be there to guide me back. This freedom wasn't about ignoring my faults or pretending I was perfect. It was about acknowledging my imperfections and trusting that God's love was bigger than them. It was about understanding that no matter how many times I fell, His grace would always lift me up again. I could let go of the fear that I wasn't enough, because in His eyes, I was more than enough. His love covered every flaw, every mistake, every moment of doubt. And in that love, I was free. Jesus continued, "When you accept God's grace, you are no longer bound by guilt or shame. You are free to live in love and light." These words resonated deep within me. I realized that accepting God's grace didn't just release me from guilt, it opened the door to a new way of living. It meant living without fear, living with love, knowing that God's love was unchanging and eternal. It meant living in the light of His mercy, where every moment was a chance to grow, to heal, and to share that love with others. As I stood there, absorbing the truth of His words, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was no longer bound by the past. I no longer needed to carry the weight of guilt. I was free to live in love, to embrace each day with the understanding that God's grace was enough. And in that grace, I found the true freedom I had been searching for all my life. As I stood in the presence of Jesus, absorbing the peace that seemed to surround Him, He spoke to me in a way that felt both intimate and profound. His voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of infinite wisdom. "The spiritual realm is not far from you," He said. "It is within your reach at every moment." These words were gentle, yet they pierced through the confusion and doubt that had clouded my understanding of the divine. I had always thought of the spiritual realm as something distant, something separate from the physical world, something beyond my reach. But Jesus was revealing to me something completely different. He went on, "Your connection with God transcends life and death, and you are always in His presence." At first, I was struck by the simplicity of the statement, but then, as the meaning sank in, it began to feel like a revelation, one that completely changed my perspective on existence and the nature of the spiritual world. For most of my life, I had seen the spiritual realm as something distant, something that only those who were truly holy or enlightened could touch. I believed that after death, one would cross over into the spiritual realm, and that's when the true connection with God would begin. I had thought of my earthly existence as separate from the divine, as if I were waiting for the moment of my death to truly be in God's presence. But what Jesus was telling me was that the spiritual realm wasn't somewhere far away. It was here, it was now, and it was always within my reach. The idea that my connection with God transcended life and death was both liberating and awe-inspiring. It meant that no matter what happened in this life, no matter the struggles, the pain, or the uncertainties, God's presence was never far from me. It meant that I wasn't waiting for a moment after death to be in His presence. I could access that connection at any time. It was a constant, unbroken relationship, one that existed outside of the boundaries of life and death. It was there in every breath I took, in every moment, and in every decision I made. Jesus explained that this connection with God was not bound by time or space. It was an eternal connection, one that reached across the physical world and into the spiritual, a thread that tied me to the divine at all times. In that moment, I realized that the spiritual realm wasn't some abstract idea or distant reality. It was woven into the fabric of life itself, and I was constantly interacting with it, whether I recognized it or not. The overwhelming truth was that the spiritual realm is not a place you go to after death. It's a reality you live in every day. The presence of God surrounds you, flows through you, and is ever present in every moment of your life. This truth gave me a deep sense of peace and clarity. It meant that I didn't have to search for God in distant places or wait for a future moment to experience His presence. He was always with me, and I was always within reach of the spiritual realm, whether I was aware of it or not. As Jesus continued to speak, I understood that this connection with God was not something I had to earn or strive for. It was a gift already given, and it was available to me at any moment. There was no separation between the physical and the spiritual. They were intertwined. The connection was already there, just waiting for me to recognize it and embrace it fully. And in that moment, I felt a sense of peace and understanding wash over me, knowing that I was never truly alone. The spiritual realm, God's presence, was always within reach. As the conversation with Jesus drew to a close, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, a peace that was so profound it felt as though every corner of my being had been touched by it. There was something about the way He spoke that resonated deeply within me, and His words lingered in my heart long after He had finished speaking. True peace comes from knowing God's love is always with you, He said, His voice soft and reassuring. In that moment, I realized that peace was not something I had to chase after or attain through perfect actions. It was already within me, simply waiting to be embraced. For much of my life, I had associated peace with external circumstances. When things were calm, when my life was in order, when I felt safe and secure, that's when peace would settle in. I had thought that peace was the result of everything around me being perfect, that it was the reward for a life lived without hardship or struggle. But as Jesus spoke, I realized that peace was not something dependent on the world outside me. It was something that existed within, something that could be nurtured by the knowledge of God's constant love and presence. His words about fasting and prayer took on a new meaning. When you fast, when you pray, let your heart be filled with peace, He said. I had always thought of these acts as ways to prove my devotion, to make myself worthy of God's love. But Jesus was showing me that fasting and prayer were not just rituals. They were opportunities to connect with the peace that God was offering me at every moment. These acts were meant to quiet the noise, to bring me into alignment with God's presence, and to allow that peace to fill every part of me. They were not about doing something for God's approval, but about creating space within my heart to experience the peace He was always offering. The most beautiful part of His message was the reminder that God's love was guiding me every step of the way. Peace came not from my own strength, not from my ability to control my circumstances, but from knowing that I was never alone, that God's love was constant and unchanging. No matter what life threw at me, no matter how many challenges I faced, I could find peace by trusting that God's love would always be there to guide me through. His love was a steady presence, a source of comfort and assurance that I could rely on, no matter what. As Jesus spoke, I felt my heart soften, and all the worries and anxieties that had clouded my mind seemed to dissipate. I no longer needed to struggle for peace. It was already there, wrapped in God's love. I could feel it in the depths of my soul, and I realized that peace was not something I had to work for. It was a gift from God, always available to me. The only thing I needed to do was open my heart to it, to allow it to fill me completely, and to trust that God's guidance would always be with me. In that moment, I understood that true peace was not the absence of problems or challenges. It was the presence of God's love, the assurance that no matter what I faced, I was always held in His care. And with that knowledge, I felt a peace unlike any I had ever known. A peace that would stay with me forever, no matter where life led me.